What is happening internationally in terms of reform of the IMF, and what can be done outside of the IMF? So these are the burning questions I think here in Sri Lanka, and I can't think of a better panel to address these questions. And again, we also look forward to your engagement and your questions as we continue to think about how to take this forward. Thank you. And now I invite Dr. Charles Abugray to make his presentation. Thank you.
First, let me, on behalf of IDEAS, express our gratitude to Yukti for this invitation to be here. Yesterday we had a really eye-opening discussion with a number of people. We learned a lot of presentations on the Sri Lankan negotiating processes and the struggles that are emerging. Today we had an opportunity to meet with others, and it's been great learning. We are really grateful. A year ago, as Ahilan said, myself and Professor Chandrasekhar were here in March, just as after Sri Lanka signed the agreement with the IMF. Professor Chandrasekhar is also here, just that he's a little indisposed. I think he has a stomach upset, so it's a pity that he can't participate in this forum. Let me also, before I kick off, say that Professor Jayati Ghosh, when she introduces herself, she says, "I teach economics." She omits to say she was a co-founder of IDEAS more than 20 years ago and remained a key player in IDEAS. Over 20 years, she and others combined full-time teaching and research with volunteering over these 2 decades to get IDEAS going. Today we can say IDEAS has grown across the global south thanks to their efforts. So, Professor Ghosh, I shall always remind you that you are IDEAS, in addition to teaching economics. So, last year in March, when we were here, just as I said, Sri Lanka had signed an agreement with the IMF, the 17th IMF agreement. My country was also negotiating its 17th IMF agreement. My country had experimented, or was made for the first time, to do 2 sets of restructuring. Restructure to meet external debt obligations and undertake domestic debt restructuring. In the forum that we had, I think it was at the library, we did warn at the time that domestic debt restructuring would be visiting Sri Lanka. It did not take a long time before we heard that in fact Sri Lanka was made the second country to undertake domestic debt restructuring. So the 2 countries, my country and yours, since 2007, very rapidly accumulated international sovereign bond debt. Very rapidly. Sri Lanka has a higher per capita income than Ghana. Nevertheless, our debt structure is exactly the same. So a poorer country, a slightly richer country, were both pushed into international sovereign bonds. And we are not the only two. And we are not the only two suffering a debt distress. There are 50 or more who are suffering debt distress in the process of debt restructuring, preparing for debt restructuring, or taking very harsh measures to avoid a formal agreement with the IMF whilst implementing IMF-type programs. It is a global issue. Why and how did we come here? I shall leave that for Professor Ghosh and Martin to explain further. But here we are. And austerity is not accidental to an IMF program and debt restructuring. The purpose of the restructuring is precisely to reduce aggregate demand, to squeeze aggregate consumption. You squeeze that so that it's savings to pay the debt. How much you squeeze depends on how much you are able to negotiate burden sharing between your country and the creditors. In this case, international sovereign bond holders. It's called haircuts. How much each of us will share the bearing of readjustment, because after all, both sides are supposed to have benefited, and for international sovereign bond holders, they already made their money. The more you can get a haircut, that is greater burden sharing from your creditors, the less you squeeze the population. The squeezing of the population takes a number of forms. The more obvious one is the cutting down of public expenditure. Although the external debt issue is largely a factor of a balance of payment imbalance, the idea is that if you squeeze government spending, given that government is a significant player in the economy, you will also squeeze ultimately imports, total demand that leads to imports. So you squeeze imports. So two things happen. You squeeze expenditure, but you squeeze imports. The import squeeze allows for a balance. That means you are importing less, you are saving more in foreign exchange, and hopefully you find other ways to bring in additional foreign exchange to service your debt and to grow. The import squeeze leads to increase in consumer goods generally. And if Sri Lanka is like my country, that's very dependent on imports for everything from sugar to shoes, then the less imports there is, the higher the prices. So the austerity takes the form of a reduction in public expenditure essential for essential services, public investment for growth, roads, electricity, and so on, but also increasing prices of imported goods. And therefore the population is double squeezed. In the case of domestic debt restructuring, there's a third squeeze. The third squeeze, as has happened in Sri Lanka, is that the long-term savings are basically captured in order, so the haircut goes there in order for debts to be repaid. In my country, we successfully campaigned against domestic debt restructuring borne by pension funds. But the haircut domestically is borne by our commercial banks, and that has a long-term impact on growth and investment for recovery. So where does the austerity come from? It comes from government cutting of expenditure. It comes from deliberate increases in prices of imported goods. It hits consumption, it hits employment, and it hits household savings. And all of this is to create the space to pay debtors. And as I have said, there is no single IMF agreement. There is a formula. They have a debt sustainability framework. They have a particular package. That package, as we will hear from Martin and others, can be contested. That alternative frameworks can be put on the table for adjustment and more just and equitable burden sharing within the population, working class and the wealthy, and between the country and its creditors. That sharing of the burden is at the heart of the negotiations that have got to take place. And when it is said that the pain today, which is austerity, that is, if the government accepts that there is a pain at all, that there is a benefit tomorrow, that benefit tomorrow is not certain. It depends on the nature of the adjustment. If it were certain, Sri Lanka would not be on its 17th IMF agreement. We would have solved that problem. The fact that we are repeatedly having agreements and restructuring means that something is not working. And therefore, the pain can be reduced, it can be redistributed, and different mechanisms of adjustment are possible. And we will hear that a little bit more from Jayati and Martin. But this is a political process. It is not a purely economic process, because first and foremost, the IMF is not just a technical institution. It's an institution that serves the interests of private capital. It serves the interests of its main owners. And therefore, it is its interest to secure as much gains for its constituency as it is our interest to secure as much gains as possible for ourselves. And it is down to the nature of the negotiations and the alternatives that is put on the table. For working class people, it is the mobilization, organization, it is the protest, it is the collective voice, it is the insistence of a different formula of burden sharing, and the refusal to accept that the only alternative is doomsday is the only way that an IMF agreement, when renegotiated, can be fair. Thank you.